All right, so welcome, good afternoon, good morning, depending where you're watching this, but welcome to our yet another session of the DMC Forum. Today we're discussing one of the other key topic when it comes to dynamics in digital markets related to competition and innovation, which has to do with the issues of acquisitions, and particularly with acquisition by big tech firms, and how that shapes basically the competitive environment, so to also affect and shape innovation incentives, both from the key players that involved in the innovation, and so startups and other innovative firms, but also, and importantly, other players that are involved in this so-called ecosystem, such as venture capitalists that are promoting are supporting the innovation or innovation initiatives by these firms, as well as other companies competing for talent or for technology with the big tech companies. So what are the issues at stake here? Well, the very first one is the motive, right? So why are firms engaging into acquisitions? Why do firms acquire other companies? Of course, there is a large literature around these topics, across the different fields, from econ to organizational management, and basically, right, it boils down to in the majority of cases of efficiencies and synergies to be obtained from merging with either the technology or assets that the company being acquired is bringing to the organization that is acquiring the company. But the key issue then is, okay, but why do you need to acquire a company rather than engaging into transactions or transfer of this technology by other means? So for instance, through the market, right? And the key answer that is emerging from particularly a literature stream that has emerged around the concept of market for technology, and particularly when it comes, to, of course, technological innovation, it's that basically there are market failures, right? So in many instances, when it comes to technologies that are hard to protect through IP or other sources of, patents and other sources of protections, and then, knowledge becomes much more a matter of being, tacit, hardly, codifying, or hardly, protecting, then basically, or there are organizational issues around it, so that you cannot just get the technology, but you need also other organizational means around it to make the technology work. Basically, in all these instances, we are facing failures in the market, and therefore the proper transfer of this technology cannot happen through market-based means. And that's when we can observe, or we tend to observe, much more entry mode from new technology in the markets via acquisition by incumbents. And so the key question then becomes whether or not this is the sole motive that is basically bringing benefits to society in terms of seeing these innovations being implemented and happening in a given sector, or whether there are also negative side effects with this, and particularly that yes, we might see more innovation coming through the acquisition in the cases of in the context of market failures. But with this, we might also see that this innovation is particularly gets concentrated under the power and the hands of few companies. So we might have sort of a paradox where we have yes, more innovation, but we also have less competition and more concentrations, and therefore more consolidation around few companies. And the key question then is this a problem? And is this the list of the problems, the different basically scenarios that we can face, or is it this deep problem to tackle? So there are a number of questions around this, and starting from by now a very acclaimed paper by Cunningham et al. That studied the phenomena of the motives behind acquisition in the pharma industry, so a different context than digital, of course, that discovered that basically, about 9 to 10% of cases of these acquisitions, were motivated by the interest of incumbent company to kill potential competition coming from, this new products being introduced in the market that were competing, were, prospective to compete with products of the incumbents. And so, the term of killer acquisitions was coined. Now there is a sort of analogy to the digital world, that basically is indicating that the possibility that many of the acquisitions that we see by big tech firms are in fact, happening, with this underlying motive of killing potential competition coming from areas where the company might already be, or the company might not be yet, but might actually be complementary area that might actually be threatening some of the core business of the big tech company, and therefore the big tech companies might actually engage into this preemptive sort of acquisition and motivations. Now so this is basically the killer acquisition argument. Some have called it also kill zone to basically indicate that the problem is not just that there is a one-to-one possible killing effect between the product or the technology that a startup or new entrant might engage in with by the big tech firms, but there may be also a chilling effect on the incentives of venture capitalists to invest in areas where this acquisition might happen, right? And here where the argument are a little bit more, well, there are different logics, contrasting logics. So one is the kill zone that basically are, where the argument is that the prospect of an acquisition happening in the particular area, will basically disincentivize venture capitalists to pour money into and support startups initiatives in that area, because there would be few opportunities for them basically to promote the innovation. Others, instead, they argue for the opposite, that it's actually an innovation zone, because the likely prospect of being acquired is particularly, what provides, the incentives for startups and likewise investors, to go there, right? So particularly, with this argument, there is, a recent article by Luis Cabral that has, fleshed basically, this market failures, right? Of technology transfer, more likely to happen in the digital context. And then the argument basically that Cabral is making is that, yes, these are all issues, but overall, there might be actually more problems in restricting ex ante this mergers, rather than focusing, in the ex post results, right? So the issue is basically being, this different facet there. What can be done, and how can we identify, if any, ex ante, right? What are the problematic cases versus, the one that promotes, this innovation at a larger space. And particularly in the cases where, yes, we might see observing on innovation, but we might also observe foreclosing of competition, right? What do we do with them, right? And then how do we define ex ante? And so the argument in my own reading, basically, the Cabral, but some others, I've also made similar arguments, is that probably we might move from under enforcement, which is by now the standard with the competition law when it comes to merger and acquisition, to perhaps the opposite, which is still inefficient, which is over enforcement, and then passing the burden over to the companies to demonstrate that there are basically good things coming out from the acquisition, in a context where to be it's difficult basically for many to predict, in fact, what the evolution will be, right? So there's also the argument of static versus dynamic competition, and particularly also in terms of business model evolution, right? So what's today might not be there tomorrow, and we know that big tech companies can also empower many of these technologies to to basically, evolve and then become something else that might spur and, additional markets around basically these products. And so there's not just an issue of product for product, but, it's also, a product that turns into a market. All right, so with a set of big questions here to tackle, and particularly, can we actually define clearly, what are the kill zone versus the innovation zone? So the negative and positive effects. So when do we have this innovation spillovers, and when instead we have discontinue innovation so therefore it's happening just because of anti-competitive moves? Can this be done ex ante, or should we rather focus on ex post, right, effects, and so tackle and observe basically what is done, and then identify better the conditions ex post? And this, as is related to the other question. Okay, and therefore, what are the sources and types of harm that we should focus on when considering basically this? And whether there are dimensions as well that we are not considering so far in the current debate, which instead are useful to focus on to understand, have a better, broader understanding of this. And one key topic I'm having in mind here is data or secondary markets that that are there basically, right, and that which might still and more importantly affect competition and the dynamics. So we have a terrific panel to discuss these issues. So you have the bio on the websites and the links, but you see also the names being shown here. Starting with Mike Walker, chief economist from UK CMA agency, and then we have other scholars who have done work on these aspects from different areas, from information systems, competition law to economics of platforms. But I will start with Mike, and Mike, coming to you. What do you see really the problematic areas when it comes to this from your own perspective as regulator, so to speak here, or an antitrust enforcer, and if any, what of these arguments to you are more sound or leading to the areas where we should put more emphasis and focus?
Okay, thanks, Camillo. I should just start as always with standard caveat. These are my views, not those of the CMA, but obviously I am coming very much from the perspective of a merger control authority. And also nothing I'm going to say is, I think, remotely controversial. I always say that. I'm not sure people always agree. Look, the starting point, it seems to me, for trying to think about those questions that we've been asked, is that two starting points for these discussions. One, big tech, digital markets have provided fantastic products that consumers love. And so we absolutely need to make sure that we are not damaging that dynamic. Second starting point is that, of course, it's innovation that matters, particularly in these markets, but I mean, more generally, it's innovation that drives economic growth. I mean, getting prices closer to marginal cost is a great thing to do, but it doesn't drive economic growth. That's innovation. So those are two starting points. So what's the implication that follow? Well, I mean, my reading of the economic literature is that it's competition that drives innovation, not entrenched monopolies. So when Camilla just mentioned there, the idea that maybe you might get more innovation with less competition, I'm thinking, well, that's not in any of my models. So I look forward to hearing more about how that works. So I think it's competition that drives innovation, not entrenched monopolies. So I think the discussion in this area needs to be around how do we protect the competitive process. And I think that means that there will be occasions where we do perhaps sacrifice short-run benefits to consumers from some mergers in order to protect against long-run harm. And I don't think that's an efficiency offence. I just think that's sensible merger control. But I'm sure we will come back to discuss that. I'm really happy to talk more about that later. I think the basic economics here are pretty simple. We know the incentives for monopolists, they're very clear. Monopolists have less incentive to innovate than entrants. That's a standard arrow replacement effect. We know monopolists will absolutely pay to avoid competitive threats, and they can do that because monopoly profits are greater than duopoly profits. So the implication is we really don't want to leave the innovation up to monopolists, I don't think, and we don't want to let them squash competitive innovation efforts. So Camillo mentioned specifically the Cunningham et al. Paper around kill acquisitions. Look, I mean, I think it's a really good paper. I don't think the concept of kill acquisitions actually helps in digital. It makes perfect sense in pharma, where you're talking about pure homogeneous products where you just want to kill that. In digital and tech, I think the issue is much more about buying a potential competitor, not killing the product, continuing with the product, but avoiding head-to-head competition. Creating differentiation that allows you as the acquirer to protect your market position, and look, quite possibly the acquirer might also reduce its own innovation efforts because it no longer needs to if it's bought a innovative entrant, which will be a concern. But I don't think we're in a world of thinking about products being killed in the kill acquisition sense. And look, I don't think this is just a digital concern. We're obviously talking about it in the context of digital markets, but this idea that monopolists might want to buy up innovative entrants is not new. I mean, at the CMA, it was the basic theory of harm in our case against Illumina PacBio, which is why we didn't want we stopped Illumina buying PacBio, and that was in, I mean, it's in genome sequencing, so it's still pretty technical, but it's certainly not digital. So that's all really clear, I think. The problem from a competition policy perspective is the fact that actually most mergers we see in this area, most big tech mergers are of complements, a point that Camillo is making. And so actually most probably are benign. And the work that the Lear consultancy did for us back in 2019, when they did a report, an ex post assessment of merger control decisions in digital markets, they made precisely that point, that actually lots of the mergers they were looking at merged by Google, Facebook, and Amazon, were of complements. They therefore had efficiencies, but also some of them were designed to protect market leadership. But that means that there is something to be lost by getting it wrong in this area on both sides. It's not just a world in which you can say, we don't like these sort of mergers, so we're going to stop them, or actually, yeah, these mergers are great. We're in that world, sort of very obvious, where actually most are benign, but some aren't. And the problem is that the ones that are not benign, I think, tend to be very costly. We think about, people talk about Instagram, WhatsApp. I mean, DoubleClick. I mean, I think it's a terrible merger. And we're, authorities are thinking about how to unwind that across the world. It's also not helped by the fact that a lot of the acquisitions we see are very early stage acquisitions. So the Lear analysis had that Facebook's acquisitions, that's over a 10-year period, that the median age of them was 2.5 years. For Google, it's 4 years. It's very difficult for authority to understand the real competitive implications of those mergers when they are so young. So we are in a world of both type 1 and type 2 errors. Okay, that means we're in a difficult world. That means we will make mistakes. But I don't think we've got a corner solution. I don't think we're in a world of saying it's all too difficult, we'll just let them all go through, or equally, these are terrible things, we're just going to block the lot and there's no real cost to that. We have got an internal solution, and we do have to try and work out where that is. So of course, what do we do about it? Well, I mean, standard merger control, we need to try and understand the market. We need to understand how the merger changes things. In digital, I think that particularly means that competition authorities need to have a lot of internal digital technical expertise, because otherwise we're going to make mistakes in both directions, and those will be costly. I think we absolutely need to put an emphasis on innovation, so medium and long-term effects, not on short-term effects from these mergers. I think we have to accept uncertainty, but not be paralyzed by it. I think we absolutely, Carmelo, should not think, oh, well, we'll do it ex post. I mean, I think that's effectively just zero enforcement. I think that'd be a really bad outcome. Okay, so I think I've got another minute and a half. So one of the arguments that we often hear is this argument around the importance for startups of having the potential to be bought out by big tech if they're successful, or alternatively, the importance of big tech for relaxing financial constraints on these firms. Look, I think both those arguments are superficially appealing, but I don't think either of them actually work. I'm sure we'll have a discussion about that. On the first, the fact that an incumbent monopolist is often willing to pay the most for a new entrant, well, we know that. That's standard incentive. It's not saying that therefore society is better off by that. And if you're going to run this argument, you have to show that actually the increment that big tech is willing to pay over the second highest bid is such that it has a significant effect on innovation. Now, maybe that's true, but I've not seen that evidence. If it's out there, I would love to hear it. And then on the financial constraints argument, I really don't think that works. If firms are genuinely financially constrained, you wouldn't expect a firm to be paying a lot of money for them, because the buyers got all the bargaining power. So if we do see firms paying a lot of money for startups, I think we know they are not financially constrained. That doesn't necessarily mean therefore it's a bad merger, but it does mean, particularly when you have very large multiples, as in things like WhatsApp or Instagram, that you do genuinely have to have a discussion about, okay, you've got to show me what the complementary efficiencies are here, because I'm looking at this and market power looks like a pretty plausible explanation. So I think those are two arguments that don't work well. Look, I have more to say, but I've used my 8 minutes, so I will wait for my second attempt. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for your remarks. And, we're going to touch base, of course. Actually, we're going to discuss deeply many of these aspects. Starting with, one of your last points, right? Because we do have some evidence and some studies being done on some of these mergers. In particular, I'm thinking of, Instagram with Facebook. And here we have, Alan has done a study on it, showing what are these other efficiencies in terms of innovation spillovers that issues from that merger and from the powering up of Instagram that was turned into a full-fledged marketplace are, and not solely in terms of efficiency for the buying companies or for the emerging entities from this, but speaking about platforms and the ecosystems of companies that build around those. What I think is more important to look at is the efficiencies that might be generated for other firms beyond the entities, acquire and target that we have in mind. So whether there is, broader spillovers that, benefits, more companies are the one that gets involved. And that's basically something that it should be taken into the question because, of course, this relates to another important aspect, which is, whether you're broader in the market or you are cornering the market, you might corner, and foreclose the particular specific niche market, which in this case might be, the one for the photo apps, which was at that moment, but you may unlock, a broader market emerging around that. And so this is, some of the uncertainties you were discussing, Mike, of, when dealing with digital. So we need to get this right on this. So coming to you, Alan, if you can enlighten us into, some of the insights from the study you conducted and elucidating a little bit more on this, complementarity is basically efficiency and particularly spillover, innovation spillovers effects for other companies that benefit from that.
Thanks, Camille. So yes, thanks, Mike, also for a very interesting discussion about what the practice in the area has go through. So before I jump into the Facebook, Instagram case study, I would like to actually comment a little bit about the killer acquisition. Mike mentioned that so it might not be that common, killer acquisition might happen in the tech industry because of the nature of the industry. Many of the complementors are actually working in a platform, but they are providing complementary benefit, not directly competing with the platform owners. So Instagram is certainly that case at that time. So the case should have gone through the review because, if you look at it from ex-pro's perspective, so the platform, the Facebook photo sharing platform now is very different now. it was compared that with 10 years ago. So a lot of small apps, they are relying on Facebook users. They are basically using other app to make photo sharing on this app. But now the platform is so different. After the acquisition, Instagram got a huge amount of users because they were being tightly integrated with the Facebook platform, so people can use Instagram to share photo on Facebook easily. So this creates some of the short-term actually positive effect, because Facebook, the acquisition actually create a signal that Facebook is trying to build an ecosystem, to try to make the photo sharing ecosystem larger and larger, so people now can use different applications to share a photo on Facebook. In the long run, as Instagram take the market share, so many of the other applications who originally operate in their platform have to actually adapt. So many of them actually leave the platform. So now if you look at the platform, Facebook sharing platform, so many of the other apps, they have either they disappear or they have adapt to be a standalone application. So this created an issue about how we can actually identify killer acquisitions. For the tech industries, many of these startup new entrants, initially they were not considered as direct competitor. So it's hard from the practice point of view to establish that they impose a credible, competitive threat to the acquirer, and the value amount involved can be relatively small compared with, like, for example, the pharmaceutical company. So that's one of the reason we don't see many of the what we call the killer acquisition in this setting. But we have to be very careful about the long-term impact. So what happened when Facebook, for example, and Instagram being integrated together, and what should we do in setting? So I have some comment actually related to not too much about policy execution or enforcement ex post, but look at that from X end. Instagram acquisition didn't go through the formal review. Didn't go through the formal review by EU. But we did not see the Instagram being killed afterwards. And one of the reason, and this is probably one of the strategy that many other merger can adopt, might be to think about some of the agreement beforehand. So before Facebook acquired Instagram, so the CEO basically has an informal agreement with the user saying that they want to keep Instagram as a standalone app. So that's an informal agreement that might factor into the strategic space, what kind of action Facebook can do in the future. So similar for WhatsApp. So before the acquisition, there was some agreement saying that, so we cannot, so the Facebook cannot just merge the data to make the advertising for the business more efficient. So we have to make the standalone. So in this case, we can avoid some of the killer application setting, like what you just mentioned. So this is sort of to add to the killer acquisition comment made by Mike. So now to talk a little bit about, so what are some of the benefit or some of the risks of big tech acquisition. So Cameron also mentioned about some of the issue is, if we allow acquisition to happen, so venture capitalists might be more willing to invest in the tech space. So we're gonna grow the entire market as a whole. So without acquisitions, Facebook or other dominant platform have to actually do that by themselves. They have to build everything in-house. So which gonna reduce the variety of offering in the market. So we definitely see that in the China market. So now there are two dominant platforms. One is the Tencent, the other is Alibaba. So historically in China, the competition law is not that strict. which means that it's really difficult to bring this dominant platform to court, so that we can say that, so this merger, this acquisition cannot go through. So because of the lack of acquisitions and the lack of enforcement in that space, many platforms, they decide to just go to the market by just doing something by themselves. So now a lot of venture capitalists, they will sort of worry that if the platform indicates they want to do something, so they move away from that space. There's basically not much investment happen if the platform indicates some certain interest in their area. So this is something that I think is really important. It's not a second order question. Actually, it's a first order question, as we have observed from the China market. So there are a couple of other studies talking about the role of venture capitalists, and the evidence, the empirical evidence actually is mixed. So for example, with some of the study looking at mobile application acquired by this big tech company, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, etc. So they found that after the platform make acquisition in a certain categories, so other developers will move away. So they move away from the affected market. But the interesting is that they might not be like just exit the market. They will shift the effort to adjacent market. So some of the categories that are sort of related, they can still leverage the capability they build over time, and also the user base they have built over time. But they try to avoid direct competition with the platform. So this brings in the issue about how to measure the overall impact of acquisition. So currently, most of the studies just look at so the acquirer and the firm being acquired, or a small subset of competitors. But it's really hard to figure out who are the competitors in the digital market, because so today's substitute or today's complement might become actually a substitute in the future. So very often the analysis is quite limited. So you look at some of the cases in the EU. So we only identify a small subset of apps they are currently directly competing with the acquirer or the firm being acquired. But technology evolves really quickly, and consumer preference shift over time as well. So it's really hard to figure out a more complete set of application of a competitor that we need to think about. So basically, it's a lot of empirical research has been done, and the results are quite mixed. So for example, venture capitalist funding, so there's a mixed finding. Innovation, there's a mixed finding as well. And one of the empirical challenges, which probably occur when agencies are trying to really do the assessment as well, is about how can we really build a dynamic counterfactual. So we are acquiring a small startup. So currently they are very small, and they have a very good trajectory to grow to be a unicorn, for example. So we have to rely on a lot of assumptions. For example, in my study, I have to rely on some of the assumption that what the market will be in the next 2 years or next 5 years. And based on the assumption, we build a counterfactual about what if the acquisition didn't get through. And we compare and contrast, so the welfare, so under the acquisition scenario and the no acquisition scenario, to figure out whether the acquisition is welfare improving or not. But it's really hard because of the uncertainty and the fast evolving of the industry. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Alan, for bringing a set of issues also from particularly pain points of as a scholar doing research in the area, and the dynamic aspect I think is the most important factor perhaps all the fil rouge of all these different issues that we are debating today. And when it comes basically to the empirics and in really assessing, right, the impact. you pointed out basically the issue, right? So that empirically the challenge is really, I mean, so the counterfactual. So what is really actually the null hypothesis that we are all testing, right? I mean, against in the studies, which certainly cannot be, you know, the static one-to-one effect, precisely also because this acquisitions happens at early stage where neither the, you know, startup nor the market conditions around it, right, are at the stage which we then can observe once, you know, the merger happens because of the combinations of the assets from the acquirer and, you know, the new complementary aspects that you know, the acquirer or target companies is bringing, and what can issue around that, right? So one of the effects in your study is precisely this, that, you know, we do see that basically other third-party companies, I mean, see benefits in terms of increase in market demand for their own products as a consequence of the acquisition, even though, of course, I mean, you know, so the issue is still, you know, okay, but this then a contest afterwards where, you know, we see more benefits for the other, for a number of other companies, right, emerging there, but wouldn't this market not emerge, right, if absent, you know, the merger between you know, Facebook and Instagram? So that's a key question, right? Because that would be basically killing market opportunities for other companies by, you know, avoiding the merger. On the other hand, right, we do have the issues that, sure, the market is growing for other companies, but this has also, you know, benefits for, of course, direct benefits for the merged entity, which can establish still the merged entity as, you know, a key player or dominant player in that broader market space, right? And so the key question is then, okay, there is still, you know, growing dominance here, although there is also more innovation. And that's kind of the paradox Mike I was referring to before, right? That we can still observe a side effect, you know, more innovation together with greater concentration. So the question then is really this, you know, long-term impact. So speaking about this dynamic aspect, right? In terms also dynamic competition incentives, I will, you know, call in Nicola, who has, you know, recently also published a paper precisely on these issues, or looking, you know, at dynamic competition and the against, you know, the usual Schumpeterian versus Arrow debate on, you know, more of a static models. And maybe, you know, Nicola, you can help here addressing some of this aspects.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Carmelo. Thanks for the invitation first. And I had prepared something, but I want to talk about something else. So this is very dynamic talking in motion here. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit. So my new thinking is I want to talk a little bit about the very spectacular and weird way in which the public conversation and the policy conversation about M&A by big tech firms is operating. And I'm going to highlight 5 or 6 points which I think should give us further, should give us a sort of call for caution, call for humility, and call for research. Okay, so as Mike pointed out, the conversation progresses without a very good definition of the concept of killer acquisition. We're basically hearing about a story which sells well because it's a bad story. It's very attractive. It attracts the press, and all the policy and political conversation moves on under this very amorphous and invertebrate concepts of killer acquisition. So there is this sort of umbrella of bad behavior casting a long shadow on everything that has to do with M&A in digital industries. So that's my first point, and I think that's very unproductive as a way to think about the issue. I know that scholars have spent a lot of time and are spending a lot of time studying this, but it remains that the political policy making conversation is essentially connoted by this narrative. Okay, so that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make again goes back to something that was mentioned by Mike, which is this trade-off or this paradox between competition and innovation. So if, as Mike was suggesting, the issue is not whether the products are discontinued or killed post-transaction, but whether they are integrated and scaled, I think one reason to tolerate efficient concentration on grounds of future innovation is in cases in which you can justifiably prove that the innovation embedded in the assets of the target have a stronger survival potential in the integrated company than outside. Okay. Now, to study this question of the different survival odds of the innovation embedded in the targets under the merger scenario versus the non-merger scenario, the focus of attention has to be on dimensions and analytics difference from the traditional assessments done in antitrust and competition policy analysis. So you need to study things like, business and management theories study a lot, whether, what makes companies fail. Issues such as, eminently survival potential, capabilities alignments, convergence and congruence in resources, maturity of the target. If the target has, very deep ingrained routines which are incompatible with the buyer, there's not much scope for the materialization of efficiencies. The problem, of course, is that in the competition field in which I'm operating, we've gone to this discussion not using these tools. We've basically tried to leverage the analytical constructs and methods that we apply all the time. And essentially, we start with market definition, which has led to very weird results in existing interventions, such as the idea that TikTok is not a competitor to Facebook because they're not in the same relevant market, or things like considering that the Facebook Giphy transaction is a horizontal merger. Okay. The third point I want to mention here is that this discussion is very insular. What I want to say here, and that again goes to a point that Mike was making about killer acquisitions being very context dependent and probably more of a concern in the pharmaceutical industry than in digital. The point here is that ICT industries, it's empirically proven. I'm going to give you some, data points here. The ICT industries have a much higher and more intense rates of entry and exit than any other industry in the past 20 years in the world. So, if you're interested in competition, you're interested in entry and exit, right? And you're not just interested in monopoly. And the levels and intensity of entry and exit in digital outcompete by orders of magnitude entry and exit in other industries. So there's very good US Census data on ICT industries. The Census data records the addition of new firms and exit of firms in ICT industries. You have subcategories. You can see in the Census data a big blip or a big dip around the dot-com bubble. You can see that the levels of entry have gone actually higher today than they were before the dot-com bubble. And then when you study subcategories, you can see that some industries record increasing entry and exit. These are things like electronic shopping or categories such as software publishing. You can see that some categories record decreased entry and exit, and these are things like equipment manufacturing or things that are outsourced in other countries and jurisdictions like support service firms in ICT. Okay, so we need to engage with this comparative study of digital versus other industries before we start to develop rules and standards specific or not specific to digital industries for supposedly killer acquisitions and predatory mergers. Right, the fourth point I want to mention is, and I'm going to be very quick now, is this risk of overcorrection. So there is certainly a problem, which is that we don't have a lot of information about all the M&A activity we see in this that exists in these markets. But the lack of information should not necessarily go with higher intervention rates in these markets, right? We need to be careful here. And we need to be careful because entry is hard and acquisition is a powerful driver to entry. So if you're conscience-minded and you're minded, you want to promote entry, you have to realize that in digital industries, entry by acquisition represents 3/4 of successful VC-backed entrepreneurial efforts compared to entry by IPO, right, or exit by IPO. Okay. The last point that I want to mention here is a point about efficiencies. So the efficiency, these types of transactions generate efficiencies which are very different from the types of efficiencies we used to study in the industrial economy. So we are talking about, team buys, acqui-hires, exchange of tacit knowledge, and spillover effects in terms of generative ideas and science. Now, we know very well that merger analysis is very reluctant to develop very strong efficiency and very strong analytical frameworks for the assessments of efficiency benefits. Many practitioners would tell you that it's very hard to make a successful efficiency defense in a merger case. Now, if you look at this through the digital lens, we probably have a lot of effort and research and work to make, because if we are already not very far in terms of efficiencies for traditional transactions, I don't know where we are in terms of efficiencies for digital transactions. So I think the bottom line of my remarks is there's a lot of premature talking and thinking in the policy conversation today. There's a very strong push to do something. We should not just do something, we should do the right thing, and to do the right thing, we need to study more.
Thanks, Nicola. Before maybe turning to Jeff on one point that goes, that speaks basically to one of your comments on efficiencies, I think, I don't know if Mike, because you touched on a point, a number of aspects, directly to some of the points that Mike made. So I don't know if Mike, you want to give, some brief answers to this before we turn into conversation, discussion mode.
Okay, look, I'll be very brief. Yeah, I do have some comments on what Nicola has said. Look, I agree with him that killer acquisition is an unhelpful narrative. If I didn't make that in digital, if I didn't make that clear enough, then I'm sorry I didn't, but I think I did. I take the point that Nicola talks about ICT being very dynamic and very high entry and exit rates. That's clearly true, but I don't think at least my concern anyways, Bird Control Authority, isn't actually over most ICT. What I'm concerned about in the digital sphere is very much the incumbency of some of the digital platforms and why that might be bad. And in a world in which when Google's saying, look, we can be replaced at any moment, they have to refer back to Yahoo, and Facebook has to refer back to MySpace, I really think we can't be talking about serious entry and exit to that particular space that these incumbents sit in. So I think it's much more a discussion about the large mobile platforms ecosystems. And I think Nicola's entirely reasonable point about ICT entry and exit is not actually relevant to that. In terms of, a risk of overcorrection, so going from under-enforcement to over-enforcement, I'm going to sound like Tommaso Valetti here, but look, at the moment we've got what's his stat? We've had 1,000 mergers, acquisitions by digital platforms that have all gone through, and we've had one block, Facebook Giphy. Okay, I get the impression Nicola doesn't like that, but 1 out of 1,000. Well, if that's an overcorrection, I'm very surprised. That looks to me like there's pretty good argument that's still under enforcement. And then, look, the point about efficiencies. Look, I actually agree with Nicola that we have to be, competition authorities are not always great at dealing with efficiency defenses. But look, I think we need to be really clear what we mean by that. What competition authorities are not great at doing is doing analysis, finding that a merger is likely to lead to damage to competition. And at that point, factoring in efficiencies and finding that, oh, okay, those efficiencies will outweigh that harm to competition. but that's actually not normally the world we're in. What we're normally in these areas, we're talking about the complementarities, pro-competitive complementarity of mergers that mean we never get to the position of having to say, actually, no, we think this is a bad merger. So I think, I don't think we're always great with efficiencies, but I also don't think it's reasonable to say that just because efficiency defenses don't usually work, that means authorities are ignoring efficiencies. I think that's a mischaracterization. The efficiency defense should only be very rare circumstances. As I say, most of the time, the complementarities mean you don't even get to the point of thinking, yeah, there's a problem with this merger. Thank you for letting me cue barge there.
Thank you, Mike. Nicola, very brief.
Yeah, sure. So I want to make clear that I think Mike was very clear that he didn't like the killer acquisition narrative. That's, I think, what I said. And I agree with him. I don't like it either. The points about incumbency is also something I want to be clear about. I think we need limiting principles. And one such limiting principles is that merger policy should almost per se prohibit any form of very horizontal merger between a gatekeeper and another gatekeeper, or a gatekeeper and a competitor in the core markets that is subject to gatekeeping. So, you would not tolerate a merger between Facebook and TikTok, for instance, much as we didn't tolerate in the past a merger between Microsoft and Intuit or Google and Yahoo, right? So, and these transactions should be completely out of the books, out of the shelf, and out of space. I mean, it's there's no, possibility for a gatekeeper to increase its market power by such a very direct and straightforward transaction. The risk of overcorrection is not so much about, numbers. I mean, these numbers, what do they mean? 1 out of 1,000. I mean, if you look at the big numbers of M&A in the entire economy, this is, gigantic. And actually, if you reduce 1 over 1,000 over 20 years, it's actually pretty small. When you look at the activity for the 6 tech platforms, if you reduce 1,000 by 6 by 12 and so on, you have pretty low activity in terms of M&A. So that these numbers, are fancy slogans, but they don't mean much. What means much is what's behind intervention. So when you think about Facebook Giphy, the signal sent by this is that acquisition of a complementer, a very pure and distant complementer to the gatekeeper, is out of the table. This is a very strong signal. It's not about the horizontal transaction that I was mentioning before. It's about basically saying that a very adjacent, a far adjacent company cannot integrate with a gatekeeper. So I think, we need to be very careful with what we say here. These numbers mean not much, but the signals we send in terms of the rationale for intervention do send very, very strong signals to industry.
Thank you, Nicola. We'll discuss these topics, I think, more later. But before I want to give, the floor to Jeff, speaking a bit more about this complementarities and, broader efficiencies, particularly when it comes not to direct, competition cases. In particular, you have, this recent paper speaking about, one of the underlying motives is actually getting access to data that can help, the acquirer to actually create, even more synergies and benefits for users as well as, and business users. So, Jeff, you want to discuss this?
Yeah. So let me kind of circle back. You asked about the types of M&A. And so yeah, what we tried to do was categorize, we found 850 some over 2000 to 2019. And we broke them along a couple of ways. Sort of at a high level, you'd say there was a functional or technology acquisition. And then you also had this acqui-hire or sort of human capital acquisition. Then I thought what was interesting is where you would go to the why. And I think if I could build on a little bit of what kind of Mike and Nicola said is, at a core level, some of these are kind of in the plumbing. And you're acquiring technology capabilities that make the core sort of more efficient, work better, that doesn't seem terrible in the sense that once you're down in the core, then you're making these capabilities available to all the users, which could be an enormous number. And so and I think it was Nicola's point that you'd want to know whether or not those innovations were going to survive and become useful in the absence of such an acquisition. And, probably not, and certainly not at the same scale. And we're talking about things like some core facial recognition technologies or kind of database technologies, things like that. So that's sort of one bucket. And then the other buckets that we saw were these kind of vertical mergers where you would be buying complements. So a service that operates on top of the core platform. That has another set of concerns. And the concerns would be, well, are you going to favor that vertical unit over other potential competitors, either through preferential access to data or literally just exclude? And so that would tell you something about how you as a regulator might want to view that going forward. Do they have it firewalled? Do they have sort of a non-discriminatory access? And then critically, and I thought Mike made this point nicely, was the need to have some sort of an audit function. And I think that's going to be true increasingly across the board for lots of reasons. And then the other mergers, and I think we've already talked about them, are these sort of head-to-head competition, where I think you can pretty clearly say, yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense if the entire goal is to just blunt a future potential competitor. And we've had emails leaked by The Verge that have sort of documented that those might have been some of the reasons, for example, behind the Instagram and WhatsApp mergers or acquisitions. So, where does that leave you? Because if you think about the harm of market distortion, that's always a concern. You think about the efficiencies. You'd like to kind of allow for the mergers where the efficiencies outweigh the harm. But where we went in that paper you mentioned, Carmelo, was to try to maintain the benefits of data aggregation and network effects. So what's different in this world, I think prior to kind of 100 years ago, when you'd look at railroad mergers or you'd look at steel companies or chemical companies, is there you could divide firms as long as they were at some sort of minimum scale, where you'd have some sort of rapidly decreasing returns to scale. And so you could imagine multiple firms competing in a single market. Now we're in this world where you've got network effects. So users create value for other users. You've got data network effects where better, more and more diverse data allows for the creation of value. And so if you start to, pull those apart, that's potentially problematic. But what you'd really like is, and this is the argument we make, is for potential entrants to get access to those data pools. And you say, well, who owns the data? Of course, it's the users. And that right now, a firm would say, look, you can go onto any one of these social networks or any system and download your transaction history and all of your contacts. And, what's the problem? And of course, the problem is that's almost worthless and the transaction costs are super high. And so that doesn't do much for a potential entrant to leverage the data that's in one of these sort of large gatekeeper platforms. So the proposal that we put forward actually builds a little on some of the kind of steps for Payment Services Directive 2, for example, that allows for firms to come into a large bank and then place transactions on behalf of an individual user using kind of core functionality of the large system, and of course the data balances and other things. And so you would take that metaphor and expand it to this idea that you'd like to have potential entrants get access to users' data where it is, so that it's contextual. So I can see, for example, my social network or my purchase history or the search history of me over time, in order to then develop potentially attractive products or services, but without ever having to port the data. And so that's a fairly significant regulatory kind of intervention, which says you actually need to open these systems up, and then you can kind of shift the basis of competition from restricting access to data to innovating on top of the data, which sort of preserves some of these innovation incentives. So that's probably the biggest proposal we had. And then we had some others around partially reversing burdens of proof, especially in the cases of horizontal mergers where there might be, some issues of foreclosure. And then let's see, we think in going through that database, so we assembled this database of all these acquisitions, and then we had a team go and try to categorize them. That's a lot of work, and who knows if we're spot on. And from a dynamic point of view, maybe things will change over time. So I think for the biggest firms, it would make sense for them to explain the rationale so that we could start to build a better understanding of sort of where firms are going with this. Because we can look ex post and then try to read things and look at the technology, look at the news releases. And then over time for the competition authorities to kind of verify, well, is that actually what happened? Did that unit maintain as a vertically independent complementer on top? Or did it end up getting absorbed sort of more into the core, in which case it might have been a different kind of an acquisition than was originally put forward. So I think, well, I'll stop there. That'll should hopefully spark some conversation.
Sure. No, thank you, Jeff, because, I think this gives us, also some leeway and opportunity to discuss another aspect of, because we're discussing a lot in our competition, but we're now defining what kind of competition we are discussing with, right? And so here we have, of course, competition within a given ecosystem. And so it's the issue, okay, are we sporting a competition there, but still, not touching, right? I mean, the ability and power of the leading firm to further shape, right? I mean, the market and the contours, right, of the contest where this competition is happening, so that, there is bigger competition, but it's competition at the edge, right? And it's about, complementors, which, might not still disturb, right? I mean, the power of the leading firm. Versus competition across ecosystems, right, where you actually have competing ways of building and facilitating value for users. When I mean users, I always refer to end users, people who consume stuff, including data, right, but also business users, so users that build on top and participating into the ecosystem to build on top, as you said, right? And so the data here are an important aspect, right? Because they also touch upon, other issues that we know with the, EU DMA, that, there are a number of things that are related to restricting, this idea of aggregating data, so creating silos, this data silos, which runs a little bit contrary to what you were mentioning before, right? I mean, the value being created from data aggregation. And then, so there are two issues, right? And to separate here, the value creation part. Yes, firms may get engaged into this acquisition to actually, have better access and sources, to other data that can then aggregate, and then, unleash this value. But then there's the issues of, splitting value. Yeah? So whether you have a concentration of this value in the hands of one or few powerful firms versus whether this value is made available to everybody, right? So we need to start basically keeping the two separates. So speaking about this, right? I mean, this, I think, this connects to what Alan was mentioning before, right? Because, in the Facebook, Instagram case, we do see sharing of this value or spillover of this, from this data aggregation coming into, repercolating into the ecosystem to other third-party companies, so business users also being part of that ecosystem. we miss, the counterfactual. Okay, what does this mean then, right? I mean, for competition, across ecosystems, but we do have a sense that there is more competition as well, right? I mean, more innovation and perhaps more competition within the ecosystem. But then we have, the open questions of, for competition across ecosystems, right? And I think this connects also to a couple of the points, Mike and Nicholas on the dynamics. So, okay, so what is the mechanism that best preserve that process of dynamic competition, right? And therefore, then spurring the incentives to keep innovating. So it's basically your point of shifting competition from restricting access, Jeff, to shifting competition onto innovating on top, right? So it's question that I don't know if you want to elaborate more, Jeff, on this aspect, also for other cases, but everybody is willing to jump in.
I'll let folks jump in and react, and then come in again.
Yeah. So, Mike, maybe you want to speak about competition across the two, the big firms.
Okay. So, look, I mean, there clearly is an element of competition, of ecosystem competition across, but between the big platforms. So you can think of Google, Amazon, Microsoft in cloud, and Google, Apple in mobile, and well, I'd say Google and Microsoft in search. I mean, it's not really a competition there. Google and Facebook in digital advertising, and look, that is clearly valuable competition. But I guess what my take on it at the moment is that I don't know, 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, we heard a lot about the main area of competition is moving to competition between the platforms, and people talked about these duopolies, triopolies, and competing. And I have to say, I think that's gone quite quiet, because I don't think we actually see a lot of competition between those ecosystems. Certainly our work in mobile ecosystems suggests a favorable competition between Google and Apple for quite understandable reasons. As I said, there's nothing between Google and Bing in search. So I'm a bit dubious about the strength of that competition, but it clearly is there. It's not no competition. So if we then think about how we develop competition within the ecosystem, which is, I think, what Jeff's highlighting, and the importance of data. Yeah, I mean, I'm 100% with him in terms of opening access to data in order to allow competition and innovation on top of the data. So when we were looking at the search market in the UK, one of the remedies that we talked about as something that we think would be a good remedy, but I haven't been able to do it yet, is opening up Google's click and search data. So other firms could innovate on top of that, because otherwise Google just has an unassailable position, because they have more data, they have a better product. People go to Google, they get more data, they have a better product. So I'm entirely with Jeff on the importance of thinking about how you open that up. Final comment is, I mean, Jeff made the point that you have to have access to the data within context, and that seems to me exactly right. Okay, I'm nowhere near techie enough to know whether that's a trivial thing or whether that's a really difficult thing, and I would love to hear the answer to that.
Okay, question for our techie.
Well, let me give
people.
a specific example on that, Carmelo. So I've in a completely different industry, I've worked with a company that has a lot of outside analytics service providers. And so, they're going to be tuning models in the industry. Think in a financial services setting or in a healthcare setting. I'm deliberately being a bit vague. But the point is, really big firm can work with pretty much any company they want to. And every one of those analytics providers always wanted a port of the data. And so often this would have to be anonymized. And so there was a lot of data cleaning. And then it would get sent out, and then algorithms would get trained models would be developed, tuned to parameters, and then you'd have something that you could make decisions around. So that was sort of the point of trying to get these outside firms. So eventually the leadership team on this said, this is kind of crazy. We're working with all these much smaller firms, very innovative, but we're not doing that anymore. And what they ended up doing was developing a sandbox, if you will. And that's sort of the precursor to then developing a way that you could put models into production. And so they invited those smaller firms to come in and build inside their cloud kind of machine learning AI environment, where they could then have direct access to the data. And that did a few good things. One of which was they didn't actually have to strip it and anonymize everything, because those outside firms would never actually see an individual record, but they would see the results of the trained algo. So that's a kind of a tangible example of in situ data access from a large firm who had all the data, but from their point of view, they were trying to solve an innovation problem, which was, we want to invite these outside firms in to use our data to innovate and create new products and services, but it's super inefficient for us to just keep porting it out and then fragmenting it and then potentially losing synchronization. And you might it might be out of context in as much as you might not have all of it, because it could be large. You might think, oh, you only needed 1,000 field sort of columns or features or whatever it might be, as opposed to getting access to the entire thing. So I think we're already seeing large companies, for their own reasons, doing things that look an awful lot like in situ access. So I think from a technical point of view, we'd have to do more assessment. That's sort of like one example. But if you're starting to see it pop up endogenously, then maybe that problem that it's solving is sort of good all around, and in terms of creating some additional value. So kind of.
Yeah. So also, coming back to Nicolas, so some of the points of, this integrations and sort of this co-specialization, right? Because with data, then, one thing is that whatever is on behind, then, there is so the point that Jeff, you're making, the contextual, it needs to be contextual, has to do also with, sort of co-specialized parts, right? Of the value. So meaning that data out of context might have no meaning. And this, then if we, of course, it's been even more clear if we talk about, technological products, right? That of course, in some contexts, combined with some assets, have some value, and otherwise as a standalone or in different, in different contexts might have, more limited value. So, a question also from a more kind of competition law perspective. So, Nicola, that's why I'm hinging to you, right? So, does it make sense to start prioritizing among some of the failures, right? Rather than looking at the efficiencies, arguments and benefits, and saying, Mike, the efficient defense you were talking before, right? Why don't we start focusing instead on failures that happen within ecosystems or beyond, right? And so can we start perhaps considering as an ex ante approach conditions where we can see failure at X, Y, Z, and then kind of prioritize it, and then say yes, so when condition X is met, we won't likely expect this failure to happen, so that should be red flag, or this is no way you're gonna merge sort of typology, if that makes any sense from a competition law perspective.
Yeah, so Camilo, I understand your question as, can we formulate theories of harm and related tests to determine which of these mergers are anti-competitive and which are not anti-competitive, right?
Correct.
So, yeah, so I think, if I try to think about this in a, say, traditional competition policy perspective, I see 4 types of transactions. So the first one is removal of an actual competitor within the product markets of the big, of the big tech buyer, say. So this could be, Google doing a joint venture with Yahoo, for instance, in search, right? And then the test that you would have in this transaction would be, you would need to prove that the merger is anti-competitive. You would probably need to prove that the actual competitor can survive in the short term on a standalone basis, and 2, that the product will be discontinued, not scaled within the firm. So, this would probably, this could be one test of anti-competitive effects. The second type of merger is removal of a potential competitor with entry potential in the actual product markets of the buyer. So this would be maybe the Facebook Giphy, so Giphy is not in the social network market, but there is a prognosis that Giphy could become a social network or enter the social network market or the ads market related to social network provision. And so then again, if we think about a test, you would need to show that the potential competitor by itself can survive in the markets independently, and then that it would have ability and incentives to enter the product market of the buyer, right? So this, I think, I'm just trying to sort of formulate some very simple steps to think about these things. The third category would be a type of transaction that could be potentially problematic, is the transaction removes a source of innovation in the industry. So this is a type of concerns you had in the Dow DuPont case in the EU, where you had this idea that there's a few entities, business corporations that can innovate in the industry and take on these very large and substantial projects. And so you want to keep a sufficient number of innovation pools in the industry, right? You want to cultivate redundancy, okay? And so then a test would be, you'd need to prove that post-transaction, the residual number of innovation pools is not sufficient. And then that, capital markets would not fund new innovators, right? Something like this. And then there's a fourth family of transaction that I really like to talk about, or a theory that I like to talk about, which, oftentimes we don't really think about, which is that the merger would remove the opportunity for a better alternative merger. Okay, so, and, if you want to think about this, one way to think about this is a sort of auction that took place to buy the assets of TikTok in the US when Trump wanted to prohibit, TikTok, a Chinese company, from operating in the US. And so there was a sort of forced sale of the US TikTok assets, and all the big tech firms, almost all of them, went to, except I think Facebook, because it was too obvious they would not, manage to, pass a merger inquiry. And so the question that was put to the people in the administration at the time was, which of these mergers is the best? Microsoft TikTok, or I don't know, Salesforce TikTok, or, and so you could think about, and so I think this is an important question, because, I would contemplate the possibility for competition policy to say no to a merger on the grounds that you want to, if in the but-for world, a merger is very likely, so this would be one element, another merger is highly likely, because the firm might disappear and so on and so forth, then you might want to prioritize another merger transaction, right? Because it makes more sense, the capabilities are more aligned, the integration potential is higher, the efficiencies are stronger, and so on and so forth. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of ordered way I think about these issues.
Thank you. So, Mike, what is your perspective from the other side of the...
Okay, so look, I really like that typology that Nicola had just laid out, but I think it sort of answers your question by highlighting why the answer to your question is no, we can't. You want some bright line tests and some simple presumptions, and I think the problem is Nicola has laid out the theories of harm really nicely, but you look at those theories of harm and they all have very significant evidential requirements, and that's where the controversy is. I mean, is So for instance, just to take one of them, okay, absolutely a theory of harm whereby this is a bad merger because it removes a firm that's not currently a horizontal competitor, but will become a horizontal competitor or might become a horizontal competitor in the future. Look, there's a really hard evidence hurdle to get over to run that argument, and it's not clear because you're looking forward, or most of the time it's not clear. So, you know, I think, you know, we can think about the theories of harm in a very structured way, but that's really important we do that. But that doesn't then make it, oh, well, that's done, we've done the difficult work. The difficult work is then on the actual evidence and understanding the underlying technology. And so that's, you know, that's going to be case by case. Just another comment on Nicola's final point, you know, about, you know, remove the opportunity for a better alternative merger, which, you know, I mean, that's in conceptually, that's in absolutely a very plausible theory of harm. And I guess, so I'm absolutely agreeing with Nicola here, you know, I think the place that might come up wouldn't be in a world in which, okay, A wants to buy B, but actually there is a better buyer for B. You know, C would be a better buyer for B. It'd be much more a world in which A is making a defensive merger because it is scared that C is going to buy B, and it is scared of the competitive force that CB will then become. That seems to be a very coherent theory of harm. But again, you know, potentially quite a high evidence burden to get there.
So, you know, follow-up questions on this, and calling also in, you know, Alan and Jeff, maybe. So what kind of research, right, would be useful here, you know, to get, you know, better structured thinking? Otherwise, you know, we all wave hands, right? And then we might come to the conclusion, okay, let's just shift the burden, you know, on the companies. They have to prove, you know, okay, but still, if we don't have, you know, a good theory, right, of harm, or said differently, you know, so what are we going to do with all the efficiencies arguments that the companies are going to bring, right? So when is that we're going to say, okay, that's fine with us, right, and we clear the merger?
Yeah, so I can sort of add to that. And so over time, I've been thinking about one approach to regulation is not to impose too much exempt, but to formulate some agreement between the acquirer and the acquired firm, saying that in order for the deal to get through, you have to, you know, promise you, so this is a set of action you can do, and this is a set of action you cannot do. So this can be potentially very helpful because, you know, firm, they face a lot of uncertainty in the acquisition, and that is discourage acquisition, which can hurt, you know, this industry as well. So if we can speed up the process and saying that, okay, so the authority gonna let the deal get through, but, you know, in the future, if something happened, for example, you think about Facebook, WhatsApp case. So when they form the deal, they say that you cannot, so the two firms cannot integrate their database together. So going back to Jeff, that's certainly not that efficient because company can use the data to kind of make the application more efficient. But if we do want to avoid like one of the firm being integrated, for example, WhatsApp being integrated into Facebook, so we want to maintain some independence between the two firms. So we can put a clause, put an item in the agreement saying that you cannot fully integrate the two applications by combining their data. Database for them. And then in the futures, so the agency will be like monitoring the deal going forward and monitor two companies going forward. And this happened actually in the Facebook and WhatsApp case. So at some point after the acquisition, Facebook was trying to actually incorporate the data from WhatsApp so that they sort of link the two database together. But that violates, you know, the agreement that they have agreed on previously. So they could not do that. So this sort of limit the set of action, some detrimental action they can take in the future, but still give the deal a green line when the two firms willing to move forward together. We sort of move some of the burden to, you know, post acquisition enforcement. So I was wondering that might be some of the approaches that we can talk about.
Sure. So I know that Nicola has to leave at this point. So unless you want to have, you know, your very final remark before leaving, otherwise I move to Jeff. Okay. Thank you, Nicola, for for being with us. So Jeff, I mean, so one way could be, so I'm going to say, well, there's a way to preserve, right, some of the efficiencies happening, but at the same time, restricting some of the plausible or possible negative aspects would be, okay, so putting some constraints, right, and then monitoring the constraints. But can we do better than this, or is the in situ access, a better way to just even SQ from, defining, the appropriate, constraints to be imposed, and say, well, you can go on, to the point that you're going to share, right? I mean, whatever value you're going to create out of it. And so that, we guarantee that there is still, not switching costs, for instance, or now tie in, and all, issues that then are basically associated, or the byproduct of, monopolization. So as well, as long as we have those guarantee, right, we can even maybe go with, any merger. What's your take on
I
this,
think
Jeff?
you can level the playing field a lot for entrants if they have access to a user's data, and then they can, create their insights and then deliver that product or service either in the institute environment or in their own environment, depending on sort of context. But I think, so that I think does a lot, and in terms of how you shift the basis of competition. But I actually want to go back to what Mike said, and also your question about what kind of research. I mean, if you look, and I'll use the example of the political ad project out of NYU, where they were trying to understand how Facebook was targeting ads, and then they got a cease and desist sort of notice on that. And you'd say, well, if we want to understand how Google operates, if we want to understand sort of how the actual search ranking algorithms work, you have to have access internally. And I'd kind of argue that that's at both levels, both from a regulatory point of view, but there's a whole research community that's also interested in these issues and can do open science that complements and sort of informs the regulators. So I think in addition to in situ access for entrants and competitors, I think there's a whole research function, because if you look at a lot of human experience, it's moved online. A lot of the way that we're interacting with the world is now mediated by these very large firms, but there's a lot of opacity about how they actually work. And cracking that open, not so much for sort of violating IP, if you will, or revealing algorithms, but mostly to say, well, A, what do the algorithms do? I don't need to look at it, but I can see what the behavior is. And B, does it do what you said it does? And C, are you adhering to your own governance principles, for example, around being non-discriminatory, sort of working to reduce AI bias? Are you adhering to those? And why would I believe you? Why would I not want to have an independent set of eyes on that? So that's where I think there's a huge space for innovation and research on these systems.
Thank you. So mindful of time. So Mike, you want to shoot 30 seconds?
Well, yes, because I've also got a hard stop. But on the research question, so where I like more research, I think I'd like more research in exactly what drives innovation in these markets. There is already a lot of that research, but more would always be better. But actually, what I'd really like is for all the agencies to be completely on top of the existing research and to make sure they keep up with that research. Because I think there is a lot of stuff that's going on in this area about what drives innovation in these markets, which is not purely economic literature. And so agencies are not great at keeping on top of that. And I think that's a real shame.
Mike, I cannot subscribe, more than 100% of this, but I would do subscribe, 100% of what you just said. And, as a scholar from the management field, particularly, I share the pain and doing my best, to kind of, bring more of that innovation. And the DMC forum is precisely, has this precise basically objective, and would like basically to contribute more to that. And there is, lots of this innovation dynamics that are powered by different means. One is shaping the market contours in this contents from the gatekeeping platform, which we know brings also side effects, right? And that's basically where I think most of the issues are here. So, but times is up. So thank you very much for great discussion. Very engaging so I have lots of notes here, lots of food for thoughts and future work eventually that powers up. So I'm hearing that there is some convergence here on a few points, that killer acquisitions is a very bad terminology to shape the narratives in this contest. We should focus more on yes, acquisition that leads to innovation, but that might still prevent competition to happen in the future. We should also look at what this acquisition do in terms of innovations and value creations within the ecosystems, and then value split across ecosystems. So whether they keep fomenting and cementing the power of the acquirer versus the ability of others to compete on the premise of some of the assets that are being acquired. And what are the possible remedies, so to speak, that might be imposed, and the working around the arrangements around this merger has been one. Opening up access to some of the assets that are also generated as byproduct, and data being one can be the other, where it can puts together keep together basically both the efficiencies that can emerge, which may be largely unanticipated ex ante by both firms and us observers, but at the same time also preserve and protect the competitive dynamics in the future by restricting firms from restricting access to the important valuable assets that are that have been acquired. So those are some of the points, summarized in a very short time. Thank you again, and enjoy the summer for those that still have to engage into vacation. Thank you again. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.